Welcome back to History Class with Dr. W and our continuing discussion of Vietnam. In the previous lecture, we began a discussion of the anti-war movement, which was ongoing throughout America's conflict in Vietnam. In this lecture, we'll focus on one of the most controversial and visible aspects of that movement, resisting the draft. At the end of the last lecture, I mentioned that resistance to the draft and draft card burnings were becoming much more common, even by 1964, and certainly by 1968, when there were more than 3,000 prosecutions for induction refusal. Resistance against the draft was ongoing throughout the war, but accelerated greatly with the anti-war movement itself by 1967. Eventually, there were draft evasion counselors and centers all around the country. Most college campuses had a counselor instructing draftees how to get out of the draft. There were many different ways to resist the draft. This plethora of ways to resist is represented well in a song by anti-war folk singer Phil Ochs called "The Draft Dodger Rag," written in 1964. I'll read some of the lyrics of that song, and then we'll talk about some specific examples derived from it. Sarge, I'm only 18, I've got a ruptured spleen, and I always carry a purse. I got eyes like a bat, and my feet are flat, my asthma's getting worse. Oh, think of my career, my sweetheart dear, my poor old invalid aunt. Besides, I ain't no fool, I'm going to school, and I'm working in a defense plant. I got a dislocated disc and a racked up back. I'm allergic to flowers and bugs. And when the bombshell hits, I get epileptic fits, and I'm addicted to 1,000 drugs. I got the weakness woes, and I can't touch my toes. I can hardly reach my knees. And if the enemy came close to me, I'd probably start to sneeze. Now clearly, this song is tongue-in-cheek to a degree. Nonetheless, Ochs identifies a dozen or more different ways that people actually did use to evade the draft, and we'll talk about some of these more in detail now. One way to resist the draft was to run. As many as 150,000 people may have fled the country to avoid the draft. Some estimates range much lower, about 30,000. Most of them fled to Canada. In 1970, for the first time, the number of Americans leaving for Canada exceeded the number of Canadians entering the United States. By the war's end, about 30% of these expatriates returned without penalty. 10% went to prison, 27% were pardoned, and 25% remained abroad. It was a very difficult decision to leave, of course. People who left the country faced the ire of their family. Many lost friendships, and many spent years in hiding, on the run, or in poverty. Another way to resist the draft was through psychiatric or mental defects. Many who attempted to escape the draft in this way did so spontaneously, with no forethought. You had to do something outrageous, but not so outrageous that they would know you were faking. Some brought letters from psychiatrists, but often these were detected. Sometimes these efforts were successful, even if the examiner knew you were faking. As one person said, they don't want the really outrageous ones because they'll know they'll do nothing but make trouble for 2 years. An example of this, it's sort of a legendary story from a person named Charlie. The time was coming for his examination. He stopped bathing and shaving for about a week. And then just before his physical, he rubbed peanut butter all around his private area and thighs. He dropped his pants. And when the doctor came in, he said, "My God, man, have you been sleeping in your own excrement?" At which point, Charlie reached down and took a lick. Yep. The Army did without Charlie. As a side note as well, some men really did go crazy, sometimes temporarily, over the anxiety of having to go into the military. Another exemption was for moral defects, under which homosexuality would qualify at that time. As one counselor recalled, All of my clients who faked it got their exemptions, but they drafted the one fellow who was really gay. The most popular take on this was to fake this one by denying being gay so loudly and repeatedly that they would assume you were lying. Another exemption was for conscientious objectors. There were nearly 172,000 of them during the war. It could be difficult to secure this status. Examiners were instructed to allow only for absolute pacifists, rather than those opposed only to the Vietnam War. And most conscientious objectors, even if they were not enrolled in the military, had to serve some kind of alternative service, some government work, charity work, or public service. Another mechanism for evading the draft was to demonstrate that you were physically unfit. About half of all draft-age men failed their physical. There was an extensive list of physical exemptions. You might also find a sympathetic doctor to write a letter outlining one of these exemptions. You could get out of serving for migraines, allergies, eyesight, hearing, severe weight loss, braces on your teeth, cancer, and dozens of other ailments, many of them outlined in the Draft Dodger rag. There was another sort of notorious case of a person who was faking poor eyesight. He borrowed huge Coke bottle glasses and stumbled around all the way to his test. The doctor said, "Read as many letters as you can on the eye chart." "What eye chart?" the guy asked. He couldn't get him to read it. Finally, screaming at him, told him to go. The guy on his way out walked into a wall. "The door is right behind you." The doctor sighed. As with a number of these exemptions, trying to fake some kind of physical ailment could backfire. There was one story about a man who tried to give himself a back injury and drove into a fence before going to his physical. He almost ended up killing himself, but he did get out of serving. One of the most famous forms of anti-draft resistance was to burn one's draft card. Ultimately, this became punishable by 5 years in prison. Nonetheless, there were some 25,000 draft cards burned over the course of the war. Of this number, only 46 people were indicted, most of them notorious leaders of the anti-war movement. It was simply very difficult to track down people who burned their draft cards. And of course, as I noted in a previous lecture, the great majority of those people were never drafted anyway, whether they burned their draft cards or not. As I also mentioned in a previous lecture, another one of the famous exemptions was for those attending college. One had to demonstrate they were making specific progress on their way to a degree. And also at a time during the war, only those in the top half of their class in college remained exempt. Nonetheless, many young people went to college, stayed in college, or perhaps went to graduate school or medical school during this time, specifically to avoid having to undergo the draft. A final way to avoid the draft was simply using the bureaucracy at work, creating red tape so that they wouldn't be able to track you down. The draft lottery itself allowed for many to escape. A high draft number would do just fine for not getting drafted. And as I mentioned previously, most were not drafted anyway. Some never registered for the draft. And of course, this again was a crime, but the government would have to track you down for doing it. Many people simply stalled. They didn't report until they could find another way out. Some people might change their address, fill out the paperwork wrong, file for conscientious objector status, simply do anything that would require the government to come after you or go through your file again and again. And of course, the manpower, the time, and effort involved in this made it impossible for the government to track down everyone who was trying to avoid the draft. And again, on a related note, those who invested so much energy in avoiding the draft were the kind of people that the Army ultimately didn't want fighting for them anyway. In our next lecture, we'll talk about another of the famous and prominent aspects of the anti-war movement, anti-war music.